was the summer after school had finished, when I finally found myself a decent paying job. It wasn't the finest place to work, but I needed cash, having spent most of it on road trips, where I did nothing but party for days. The shop was small, and it turned out that I was the only staff available for the night shift. I settled down well enough, thanks to my manager Mark. He was a nice guy, always smiling, helpful, and never once had I seen him angry. I remember a week back when a customer started getting heated, some steroid-jacked asshole whose card declined at the till. I tried telling him that I couldn't just let him off this one time, but then he grabbed my collar and started cursing at me. Hearing the commotion, Mark came up to the customer and politely asked him to release me. Naturally, the juicehead didn't, so Mark put a hand on his shoulder, which earned him a punch to the face. A punch like that should have knocked out a scrawny guy like Mark, but instead, blood gushing from his nose, he straightened up and asked the guy to leave, showing no pain or emotion. At that, the customer left quietly, all the while being dumbfounded. Mark nodded at me and went back to his back room, as if nothing had happened. So yeah, aside from the extreme work hours and the occasional asshole, the job wasn't too bad. It was the second week of working there, that Sunday, a slower day than usual. Normally on Sunday nights, there'd be a decent amount of people lining up to buy drinks, except today. The first customer didn't arrive until 2 a.m., just under halfway through my shift. He was strange, to say the least. He wore nothing but an oversized hoodie, which thankfully covered the top half of his legs. He seemed alert. His eyes darted around like a pinball machine. I thought he was high or something, although it wasn't uncommon to see in my shifts. He disappeared somewhere over in the third aisle, before the doors were abruptly barged open again. A second guy came in, wearing a business suit, hair slicked back, and stinking of cologne. A late-night worker like me, but working a job that quadrupled my salary. He ignored me. Clearly I wasn't worth paying attention to, and instead he headed over to the alcohol section. I didn't see the hooded person for a while, so I watched YouTube. Suddenly, there was a crash from outside, like metal slamming against metal. The backroom door opened, and Mark came out. "You should check that out," he said. "I'll work the till for a minute." I went out to investigate, trudging along the parking lot. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I noticed the overturned bins where a family of foxes were having a feast. I went back to the store. I wasn't paid enough to do anything about it. Taking over from Mark, who went back, I attended to the businessman, who didn't let me scan the products. Instead, he threw a wad of cash, deftly leaving with a bottle of Jameson's. There was another crashing sound, but I ignored it, thinking it was the foxes again. That's when the guy with the hoodie came into sight again, this time with a grin and a large jug of bleach in his hand. Before he could even make it to the counter, he spewed up a tide of vomit, splashing around his bare feet and all over the aisle. He fell unconscious, spilling the bleach. Groaning, I took up a mop and went over to clean up. Pulling the man over to another aisle, I got to work against the stain, grimacing as I recognized the smell of piss. After about 10 minutes, I'd finished up most of the floor. Then I went over to check the bumper clot. Except he wasn't there. I looked around the store for a while, but no, nothing. I went back to my station, where sure enough Mark sat. "Did somebody leave?" I asked. He didn't look too good. "No, nobody's coming or left yet," Mark replied, looking a little puzzled. "You cleaned up the floor?" "Yes." With that, Mark left, and I finished off the next 3 hours of my shift. Occasionally, I'd hear the thumping again, but thought nothing of it. Finally, I was home and went straight to sleep. I awoke to furious knocking on the door. I scrambled to my feet and doubled back when I saw 2 police officers. They introduced themselves and asked if they could interview me. There had been disappearances around the area, and investigations hadn't uncovered anything. They wanted to know if I knew anything about them, and sure enough, things became familiar to me. Missing people like the steroid head a week ago, or the businessman, and the hooded guy. There were other missing customers as well, and eventually, I asked them if they were questioning Mark too. They stopped. "Who's Mark?" they asked. The manager. He works the same shifts as I do. "We've checked the company records. There ain't no Mark on there. Only you." After a while of exchanging words, they put me into a police cruiser and drove to the store. They told me to show them where Mark was. A vague request, and I prayed that he was in today. So far, I knew that I looked like the prime suspect, and only Mark could confirm that I was not involved. I led them to the backroom door and knocked. No response. I knocked a little harder. Still nothing. The police took over, kicking the door down and switching on the light. The horror before us would be something that would never leave my mind. I retched uncontrollably as the stench overpowered me. Stacked up against the far wall were piles of bodies mixed in with each other. Some of them were headless, others missing limbs. The buzz of flies was deafening. The officers cuffed me, quickly whisking me away to the police station. My trial's set to be soon, and as it stands, I'm going to jail. They filed through records, pictures, footage. I was the only one ever seen. But I swear to God, Mark was there. He always was, and I don't care if they call me crazy, because even in the dead of night, in my cell, I can see him in the corner of the room. Grandfather always sits near the fireplace, looking into the embers for hours at a time. This has become like second nature to him. Any day, any hour, he'd be sitting dead still in that armchair, eyes empty. The crackling of the wood, the only sound in the room. I always hated going to my grandfather's place for this reason, but I finally knew why he was always like that when I asked my mother. I figured it wasn't a topic that she was particularly happy to talk about, but she knew it was about time I was told. Taking my hand, we went downstairs, and she carefully shook my grandfather's shoulder. As if he had been slumbering for years, he jerked his eyes wide open, and he looked around the room frantically, hands shaking. After calming down a bit, his eyes focused on me. My mother nudged me gently. I gulped and asked what had happened to him. Hearing these words, a little colour returned to his skin, but he still looked as frail as ever. Eyes darting to every corner of the room, he opened his mouth and began to speak. It was December 1914. The First World War was in full motion, and across Europe, battles were fought furiously. My grandfather had just arrived in France from England. He spoke of how the land was no longer recognizable. It was just a muddy landscape with craters and flooded with rainwater. The stench was unbearable, and seeing the wounded in makeshift tents, screaming in pain, scared him. But he felt safe, knowing that his comrades were around him, in equal awe of the horror. When they reached the trenches, it was Christmas Eve. Night had already fallen, and it was all but silent. Huddled around a campfire, they watched the distant bombs fall, creating small orange bursts in the skyline. There was small chatter about what was going on back at home. The older lot, desperate to hear news from the newer guys. Every now and then, the sound of gunfire would stop the conversations, before they started again. The guys suddenly decided to brighten up the mood with a little Christmas carol. Silent night filled the trenches, one voice at a time, until a steady orchestra had begun. Then across in no man's land, the Germans joined in their native tongue. For a while, both sides took turns in singing different Christmas tunes, until an officer came around and hushed up the men, claiming it was fraternization with the enemy. They fell into their sleeping holes not long after, but my grandfather had different plans. At the dead of night, he climbed over the top and began to make his way across to the Germans. He was confident that they were friendly folk, and he wanted none other than to make some new friends, however unlikely. Just in case, he brought his rifle with him. He reached the German trenches, where it was just as eerily quiet. Pitch black. It was difficult to make out any shapes. That's when my grandfather accidentally tripped over, creating a ruckus as he did. Worried, he stood himself up again, scanning with his rifle. Nothing. A dripping sound was all he could hear, making a steady rhythm. He began to walk, using his hands to navigate in the dark. All of a sudden, there was a sobbing sound. He began to walk faster towards it. Eventually, he came across a German soldier laying in a fetal position, hands over his ears. Crouching, my grandfather shook him by the shoulders, but he made no sound other than whispering. Nein, ungeheuer. Just then, there was a crackling noise from behind, like bones twisting against each other. It was sickening to hear. The German screamed. My grandfather turned around, rifle raised. It had no face, just a skull. Inches away, fetid, foul. It wasn't human. Limbs bent at uneven angles, its hand reaching out. Blood flooded from where its eyes would have been. Just then, my grandfather began to shake unbearably. His lips quivered. The glass of medicine in his hand dropped. My mother shooed me upstairs, closing the door behind. The last sight I saw was the froth building up in his mouth. I clambered upstairs, scared of what I had heard. I turned the knob to my bedroom. I lived in suburban Tokyo for a while. It was a quiet little place with quiet little people and quiet little rumors that seemed to spread like wildfire. Of unfaithful spouses and noisy neighbors, the place only ever seemed lively whenever something scandalous happened, which would be the topic of conversation for the week before another rumor would inevitably come around. Our family was subject to this treatment the day we moved in from the countryside. Whenever they were around us, they would shake our hands and congratulate us, but the moment they thought we were out of earshot, words such as bumpkin and yokel would find their way to us in hushed whispers. Regardless, we found a way to pay rent for our overpriced one-bedroom flat, and even to fund me to go to a prestigious private school. There was nothing more important than my well-being and education. My parents worked hard to ensure that I did not go hungry or wanting, while they were pushed to the extremes, often finding them passed out on the couch before their next 12-hour shift. I thought it was all unfair, but more often than not, they would simply reply with nothing but scorn, saying that working hard was part of the process, something that I took to heart for the rest of my life. School was nothing but torture. From the moment I stepped foot, I knew that I was different. Like the neighborhood, it was nothing but murmurs. I sat alone in every class, and the library became my second home, endorsed in reading or studying for the next exam, while everyone sat in their groups, throwing quick glances my way, whispering and then laughing aloud. The second month was worse. They took any opportunity to make my life a living hell, wrecking my desk, breaking my locker, while any attempt to appeal to a teacher was met by nothing but stony silence. A curse of some sorts had come over me. Once, another boy decided to talk to me, which lasted for a grand total of a minute before he became self-conscious of all the judgment. I became the outcast, the excommunicated one. I realized then that I was truly alone, and that for at least a few years I'd have to endure. My parents' words never left me, and I racked up A's on my tests as terms went by. I had to move away from the library eventually. There were too many people, too many chances to make fun of me. I locked myself up in the school toilets instead, where I found a little more peace, paging through books and notes until break was over. And it was in those toilets on that fateful day that I met her. I was quite tense. For some reason, I felt as if something was watching me. I struggled to focus, numbers and letters becoming all but nonsense to me. Within a few minutes, I was already drowsy, my mouth dry. Opening the stall, I looked left and right, saw no one, and walked to the basin where I splashed my face with water. I looked in the mirror for a while. I thought things that I thought I would never have to contemplate, about how my parents' lives would be so much easier if I disappeared. I retreated back into the stall and felt the tears flowing freely. Suddenly, I felt a hand upon my shoulder, and I feared the worst, that there was some other kid who found me crying, that the bullying would intensify. Only it was even worse. I looked up to see a girl in a white shroud, bloody handprints across the dress, lank black hair, so long it tickled my cheeks. I could only stammer, frozen, unwilling to move. Her hand gripped harder, to the point at which my shoulder began to ache, but I was too scared to move. She spoke in an ethereal voice that seemed halfway between reality and a dream. Her words didn't seem material.
Tell me why you are here?
I didn't reply.
Why are you crying? You are sad?
I nodded, fixing my gaze on the stall door behind her, calculating, reading if I could escape.
I can make all your problems disappear.
No, you can't. No, this isn't real. This is all just a dream. Go away, demon! Stay back!
I kept yelling and screaming, and then shut my eyes tight, tears threatening to drop. Looking back up, there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I picked up my bag and looked around the room.
Make my problems go away. Please.
The day went by. I dragged myself home, opening the door to an empty house. My parents wouldn't be back until morning. Like clockwork, I made myself dinner, studied, and went to bed again. It was all routine. Outside, the wind howled a little louder. The next day, I noticed something. The usual kids who bullied me were nowhere to be seen. The day went a little smoother than usual. Not being paranoid of a beating around every corner did that to you. I went home, made myself dinner, studied, and went to bed again. Again, the same. The next day, as the homeroom teacher read out names, half the class seemed gone. In the middle of maths, a worried parent came barging into the room, beckoning for the teacher. There were words of anger outside. I went home, made myself dinner, studied, and went to bed again. The third day, an assembly was called. Students had gone missing, all in one night. We were to be escorted to school until further notice. Of course, I had no one to escort me, but I'd be fine. Rumors circulated, rumors again, rumors that I was responsible for the students going missing. However, that wasn't the case, as rumors aren't always true. But I knew who was responsible, and she kept me company. I see her always, dancing across the floor in the blood-stained dress that sways in the wind.
I was 16 and we met on Facebook. He went to a school nearby, and we decided to meet up for a movie. We had a great time together and ended up dating. First time he came to my parents' house, he had an ankle monitor on for house arrest. and wouldn't tell anyone why. Red flag number 1. And since he was a minor, we couldn't find out. My parents obviously didn't allow us to hang out, so we hung out at his house or around town, at the YMCA camp. I was rebellious and naive. Things started to get weird when I noticed his family was pretty odd. One day we were doing it in his bedroom, and I saw his father looking in through the blinds. I screamed and called him out, and his dad ran off. The stalker guy told me that his dad was just into redheads and liked to watch us, so this wasn't the first time. I went to leave, and his mum was doing crack in the kitchen, so I decided it was time to break up, and this is when things got bad. He started crying and told me that he's in cancer treatment, and that's why he needs me. He doesn't have long to live. I believed him and told him we could be friends. This is when the stalking started. He switched schools to my high school, but never went to class. He would just stand outside my classroom looking inside until it was passing period. When I would leave class, he wouldn't address me. He would just follow, about 10 to 15 feet behind me to my next period, and stand outside the classroom again. I was too intimidated to say something to him, as he was 6'4" and heavy set, so I just let it happen for a few weeks. It started to progress when he would follow me home every day. He would get on the same bus as me, despite living across town, and walk 10 to 15 feet behind me all the way to my house. He would stand outside, just staring up at the window, until around the time my parents got home, and then he would just leave. Finally, I told him to piss off and leave me alone. I told him we could no longer be friends or acquaintances or anything, and to forget about me. However, that escalated things way further. I started getting about 150 calls a night. Half of them were him screaming death threats and in detail torture methods that he wanted to do to me, and the other half were him singing me love songs that he wrote on his guitar. Every time I blocked his number, he seemed to just magically get a new one and leave more messages on that. I woke up one day to see that overnight, he had left me one of these dancing, singing snowmen on my porch. He had stabbed it in the head, and the knife was sticking out. He covered it in his liquid deodorant that I had previously mentioned liking the smell of, and I noticed that there was a hole where the little song recording device was. When I pressed the hand, it was not the regular Frosty the Snowman song that played. It was his voice singing eerily, "I'm gonna have you forever. I'm never gonna let you go." I was done at this point and told my parents, who contacted the school. They suspended him, but he still waited at my bus stop every day and walked to my home with me. One day he ran at me, like he was gonna tackle me. When I tensed up for the impact, he stopped and hugged me. It wasn't a regular hug, it was like he was trying to crush me. I was 5'1" and about 90 pounds at the time, and he ended up cracking one of my ribs. I cried and he started crying too before running off, and he left me a voicemail apologizing in song. This one night is the night I'll never forget, and it's the reason why we got a restraining order and my dad got a gun. I woke up one evening for no reason. I was just fully awake. I got up to go to my kitchen to get a glass of water and relax, and in the reflection on my fridge I saw movement in the backyard. I couldn't see well because it was so dark outside and so light inside, so I went to the back sliding glass door to get a better look. When I got closer, I was met with the silhouette of a 6'4" man standing just outside the door. The stalker guy was standing in my backyard under my room at 3 a.m. He was just staring at me. I yelled at my parents and got them up, but of course he was gone by the time my dad got outside. There's a patio right outside my bedroom window that goes all the way around to the ground, so it's possible he could have been on top of the patio looking directly into my bedroom window before. We got a restraining order granted shortly after, and stalker guy dropped out of school. I haven't seen him in person, but every 6 months-ish, he makes a new Facebook and tries to friend request me. I block and report it every time. Have you ever heard that myth that if you wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, there's likely someone looking at you? Well, maybe it's true.
My name is Chris, and this story happened about 2 years ago in September. I was 15 years old and had at the time started a new school. I was there for about 2 weeks and I had yet to make any friends. There was another new student that started. His name was Caleb. He was a bit socially awkward, but we started talking, hanging out together, and soon became friends. We both had something in common in being the new kids at school. I hung out with Caleb at school a few times during the weekends. The more time I spent with this dude, Caleb, the more uncomfortable I became around him. He would always speak about strange or depressing topics. He would ask me things like how I will kill somebody and get away with it. Every weird question he asked me, he would then tell me in great length and detail what he would do in that situation. It was like he thought about this stuff all the time. One weekend I went to Caleb's house for a sleepover. When I arrived at Caleb's house, he was home alone. Caleb never spoke about his mom, and he told me that his dad was always working late and he wouldn't see him until the morning time. So we ordered pizza, played video games, and watched movies until late at night. I remember looking at the time and I saw it was 2:40 a.m. I said I was tired and I told Caleb I wanted to go to sleep. So I went downstairs because I would be sleeping on the fold-out couch and Caleb would be sleeping in his room. It took some time for me to fall asleep because Caleb kept me awake by walking around upstairs and switching the lights on and off. I remember having an awful dream that I was drowning and I felt like I was about to die. I woke up in a panic and Caleb had his hands around my throat. He was shaking me. I sat up coughing and struggling to breathe. After I sat up, Caleb asked if I was alright and told me that he came downstairs to get a glass of water and saw it looked like I was having a nightmare, so he shook me to wake me up. I told Caleb I was fine and I thanked him for waking me up. Caleb went back upstairs. I was a bit shook up from what just happened, so I didn't fall asleep right away. I eventually calmed down and managed to get back to sleep after about an hour. When I woke up in the morning, I saw Caleb sitting on the couch on the other side of the room, staring at me. He said I should leave because his dad would be home soon. It was an odd way to end our sleepover, I remember thinking to myself. I thought about if Caleb's dad even knew I was even staying over. Either way, I didn't feel welcomed anymore, so I did what Caleb said and I left to go home. About 2 days later, someone on Facebook messaged me saying that they saw that I was friends with Caleb, and they told me that Caleb used to go to their school. He didn't warn me to stay away from him. He said Caleb was accused of killing another student at a sleepover, and the case went to court. Caleb was found not guilty due to a lack of motive and evidence, but the school Caleb was at didn't want him there anymore. I wasn't sure if I believed what that random person had told me about Caleb, but I did think about the recent sleepover I had. I thought about if Caleb really was trying to wake me up from a nightmare, or was he trying to kill me in my sleep? Caleb did make me feel uncomfortable at times, but after being told he was accused of killing another student, it kinda made me afraid of him. I decided not to spend so much time with Caleb after that, and only hung out with him in school. About 2 months later, he moved away, and I eventually lost contact with him, until a few years later. I saw something on Facebook about a murder in another town. I saw Caleb's picture and I read about what happened. Caleb managed to get a girlfriend, and one day he went to her house to spend time with her while she was babysitting her brother. While Caleb was there, his girlfriend fell asleep as he played video games with her younger brother. She woke up to a woman screaming. That woman was her mother. Caleb's girlfriend went downstairs, saw her mother on her knees screaming. She then looked over at the game area where her brother and Caleb were. At least she thought Caleb was there. What she saw was horrifying. Her brother was laying on his back. Blood was everywhere. But that wasn't the worst of it. His head was missing and Caleb wasn't anywhere to be found. They immediately called the cops, and Caleb was actually caught roaming the streets with blood all over him, including his mouth. Caleb confessed to killing the little boy, but he also confessed to eating parts of him. One thing that they never found was his head. Caleb doesn't remember. Well, at least that's what he told the police.
Before I even get to my story, I want to emphasize the point of me writing this. There was more than enough blame for what happened to go around for all of us. The decision was ours to cut corners. Trusting our mother's home to a stranger was stupid. No one denies that. However, The events that unfolded as a result were 100% not our fault. We did everything society tells us to do. The police were called, and their job was to protect my sister. They failed in their job. This is on their hands. My number one aim is to impress upon you to know that it's important to fully vet any individual before allowing them to access your home. The following story is written to drive home this very important point. At the end of 2019, just before Christmas in fact, my mother passed away from a long-term illness. As I was already married and set up in a home of my own, my mother left her home to my younger sister, Emily. Emily had been renting up until this time. Her lease had just ended, so she moved in until she was sure of what she was going to do with it. She knew she had my support regardless of her decision. My wife and I threw her a surprise housewarming party for her. At the party, one of Emily's coworkers gave her a kitten as a gift. She'd been unable to have any pets in her apartment. It was love at first sight. The weeks after the party were life as usual for all of us. Emily managed to litter train the kitten, and all was going well. Just before Valentine's Day, Emily's employer notified her of a business conference she was required to attend. It was part of her job, and this would be her first trip since she had moved into the new house. Normally this would be simple, but now, with the kitten, things were a tad more complicated. My family was unable to watch the kitten because of my daughter's allergies. Kenneling was briefly considered until the price was found to be too great. Besides, she didn't like the idea of her precious little angel being locked up for 3 days. She chose to search on Craigslist for house sitters. An earlier call to a service proved too high also. She found this young girl, around 19, who claimed to be an independent house sitter. They spoke first on the phone, then met at the house so she could look around. The girl seemed kind and professional. After agreeing on an amount, the deal was set. 2 weeks later, Emily kissed her kitty goodbye and left for her trip. She checked in the first night and all sounded like it was going well. 2 days later, she returned to a nightmare. The clean, beautiful home she had left was now scattered with clothes and dirty dishes. When she confronted the girl got mad and said she wasn't a maid. Things only got worse from there. My sister was horrified to see that the litter box was full and the kitten had already began going on the floor. Certainly not the poor cat's fault, and this infuriated my sister and she refused to pay the girl. An argument broke out and the police were eventually called. They really couldn't do much other than force the girl to leave the property, but the girl was furious. She vowed she'd get back at my sister as she left. This was all said in front of the police, but they obviously didn't take the threat seriously. The officer went on their way and my sister began cleaning up the mess inside. A few days passed and Emily tried to put the experience behind her. That Friday, soon after returning from work, a man rang the doorbell and asked for her. She identified herself and the man began demanding the money owed to the young girl. My sister calmly explained the situation, but he only grew more aggressive. Although she was now terrified, she held her ground and refused. This was when the man backhanded her. She fell back and hit her head on the floor. Unfortunately, he wasn't done. He approached her and demanded the money again. My sister, who was clearly concussed, didn't answer, so he punched her unconscious. Apparently, while she was out, he entered the house and stole all the cash from her purse. By the time she had awakened, he was gone. It took her several minutes to crawl to her phone and call 911. They arrived soon after and she was rushed to the hospital. I'm happy to say that there's no long-term physical injuries, but mentally, Emily was a mess. And still is, honestly. To be frank, had I known the identity of the man and his location, I would have killed him. Fortunately, I regained my senses and agreed to leave it in the authorities' hands, despite their inability to prevent it. The responsible parties were found and arrested within a couple of days. It wasn't some great mystery after all. The man who assaulted Emily was an ex-boyfriend of the young girl. She had promised him half of the money to retrieve it. The young girl claimed she never intended anyone to be hurt, but her threat in front of witnesses, cops at that, sealed her fate. She managed to get away with probation because she had no priors. Her ex, on the other hand, had a long record. He was given 3 years. But once the COVID crisis began, he was released early. The entire family was less than happy to hear of the lenient sentences, but criminals getting off easy is nothing new under the sun these days. In the months since the attack, everyone has done their most to be there for Emily. Her recovery is going well, and she seems to be responding to therapy. The lockdowns have proved a blessing for her. She's been able to heal at a much slower and calm pace. Until restrictions are lifted completely, she'd been approved to work from home. Her little furry friend has served as a priceless companion for her during this terrible time. Although some may say he was the cause of this whole awful mess, I'm glad he's been around to keep her company. I don't want to be too specific with details here, but I'm sure you'll understand why I'm wise to being a bit paranoid by the end of this. I've been into urban exploring, or urbex as people are calling it these days, for just as long as I can remember. I think it all stems from being an extreme introvert. How when other kids were playing together on jungle gyms and swing sets, I preferred being off my own, exploring some hidden corner of the park or wherever we were. By the time I was a teenager, I was cracking bigger and bigger targets, traveling across town on my bike on weekends to tag derelicts with a can of spray paint. Then in my 20s, I was traveling across the Northeast to hit up some classics, as well as some lesser-known derps that hadn't been scouted out all that well. But I definitely had 2 or 3 haunts in my hometown I'd hit up once or twice a year, just to see how they were progressing, so to speak. It's more like degressing, actually, but you get my point. Buildings would accumulate filth, become home to animals, maybe people. You'd get graffiti artists coming in and out. It was nice seeing them age. Of all the places I'd thought I'd come closest to losing my life, it definitely wasn't in my local toads. I knew them like the back of my hand, and they were my favorite because they were relatively safe. But anyway, on with the story. I'm wandering around this big old industrial complex, marveling at how Mother Nature seemed to be slowly taking it back, one cracked paving slab at a time. I stopped to eat some sandwiches I'd packed with me, sitting up in the office of an old factory that looked over the shop floor. All the glass was smashed out, and I'm just sitting in the filthy old chair trying to eat as cleanly as possible when I suddenly begin to hear voices. At first, I start to worry, thinking it might be security or even the cops. I didn't think the place had any active cameras, or that I'd been spotted by anyone on duty, so I'm kinda angry at myself for slipping, at least until I hear the voices getting louder and louder. They didn't sound like cops at all, but they were definitely headed into the building that I was in. The only question was, what were they doing there? But unfortunately for me, it wasn't long before I found out. This isn't exactly what they said, just a close approximation from memory, but here it goes. Guy 1. I'm telling you, man, this is bad news. They got him with 12 keys and he's gonna roll on us. Guy 2. We can get him county, that's not the problem. It's the names he drops between now and then, the ones that can get back to us. Guy 1. But do we even know who he's named? We can't just rub out 6 guys assuming they're all gonna turn states. Guy 2. We don't have a choice. Guy 3. He's right. There are almost $500,000 at stake here. We can't afford to take chances. Everyone has to go. Guy 1. Wait. You gotta be kidding me. We're gonna rub out 6 of our own guys? Guy 3. You heard what I said. Get it done. Anyone who knows, get it done. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Some kind of murderous criminal conspiracy, possibly over drugs or other illegal imports, and it was going down just meters away from me. Now try to think of the worst thing that could possibly happen at that point. Outside of the world getting hit by an asteroid, what's the one thing you wouldn't want to happen in that situation? For those of you that answered, my phone suddenly going off, then ding ding ding, right answer. Because right as these guys were about to leave, I got a call. I didn't even see who it was. I just mashed the lower volume button to silence the ringtone, then heard, "Who's that? Who's there?" before the sound of running. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life. And if it wasn't for the fact that I knew the place like the back of my hand, I might not be here telling you all this today. I was so scared that I didn't even go home that night. I just went to another of my favorite toads and hung out there until morning, only leaving when I was certain that I wasn't being followed. In retrospect, I don't think they saw my face or anything, and they probably thought I was an undercover narc or something, I don't know. But nothing ever came of the incident, and I had no idea who the guys were to be able to follow their case in the news or whatever. It was definitely the scariest thing that's ever happened to me while urbexing though, and it's taught me to, overall, expect the unexpected.
I still couldn't believe it. 2 years wasted. For 2 years, I dated Ji-young. What did it mean to her? Just free dinners and rides to places? What else? For weeks, I wallowed in self-pity, shut in my room, hearing the ticking of the clock as I tried desperately to find sleep. Instead, I found myself questioning everything, wondering if anything I had done was worth a damn. It came to its worst when I bought a gun from the dark web, adamant on ending it all right there. Until a letter slid from underneath my front door. I opened it. "Hey Dong-yan, we were wondering how you were feeling, man. You haven't picked up the phone, and we tried knocking, but no one answered. Come see us at Hansock's on Saturday. The theme's Squid Game, you know. It's the Netflix show that everyone's talking about. Hope to see you soon, buddy. From Minjae." I sighed and scrunched up the letter, tossing it into a bin. I went on Amazon and ordered myself a costume. I might as well go to the party. About a week later, I found myself at the front door of Hansock's, wearing the green jumpsuit from the show. I'd only watched about half of it. Correction, I watched half of it with my girlfriend. Well, before, you know. It was okay, but never really caught on to me. But it was the theme of the party, so I followed it reluctantly. Before leaving my car, I checked the glove compartment, and there was my gun. I still didn't feel happy inside, and even on the drive here, those suicidal tendencies didn't seem to go away. I vowed to keep the damn thing with me until I felt better somewhat. But hell, things still weren't looking good. Hansock's house was outside of the city, this small cottage that he rented from his grandma. It was a nice change of environment from the constant hustle and bustle of the city. I felt 10 pounds lighter already. I knocked and was almost thrown aback as a familiar face threw its arms around me. It was my friend Yuna. She had always been good to me, even as kids.
"Come inside,"
she said, taking my hand and leading me inside.
"You're contestant 456, right?
Huh?
Your number, silly.
She jabbed a finger against my chest.
Have you even watched the show?"
Little, yeah. Anything else she said was lost on me as I noticed her. Rage burned inside me. I clenched Yuna's hand tighter. Across the hall, there she was, my ex, Ji-young. And beside her, none other than Tae-hyung, the guy she replaced me with. I caught her attention, and she stopped mid-conversation. I was brought back by a slap on the wrist.
"Hey, you're hurting me."
Sorry.
"What are you looking at?"
Yuna looked at Ji-young and nearly choked.
"Yikes, I completely forgot. Come on, we'll hang out with these guys."
When my friends saw me, they let out a cheer. "So he ain't dead after all." I winced a bit. "Or he's back from the dead," said Han-sok, slapping a hand around my shoulder. "Look, man, I didn't know Tae-hyung was gonna invite her, alright? I'm sorry." I chuckled in response and assured him that everything was okay. "Things happen, man, but I'm over it." "Good to hear. Now, who's up for a game?" Everyone gathered around, and it was only then that I noticed Han-sok was the only one wearing a different costume. We were in the green jumpsuits, but he wore this black outfit, complete with the mask. If I remember right, he was supposed to be the front man or something. It was only fitting, being the host of the party and all. Every now and then, I stole a glance at Jiyoung. She seemed so happy. Why couldn't I be like that? Before I could think of anything else, Hansok clapped his hands together, catching our attention. Today we'll be recreating the games from the show, ladies and gentlemen. He bowed and led us into his garden. It was a sizable one, with enough space to run around in it. I think most of us knew what the game was before it even began. Hansok then explained the rules of red light, green light. At the end of it, he reached into his pocket and drew out a pistol. We all chuckled a little as he pretended to shoot each one of us. Without further ado, he turned his back on us, and we slowly made our way to the other end. Anytime he turned around, we stopped in our tracks, and so on. We continued this pattern until all of us were only about 5 meters or so from reaching him. I noticed Hansok didn't make a single sound, not even when we giggled or laughed. It felt a little off. Suddenly, Taehyung tripped, caught mid-sprint by a pothole. He shrugged his shoulders as Hansok pointed his weapon at him, and then fired. It sounded a lot louder than what we were expecting, but instead of a yelp or short cry from getting hit by a BB pellet, Taehyung just fell on his face. No sound whatsoever. We all withheld from laughing, but amusement turned into horror when a red patch began to form under him. Hansok turned his back again, but this time I ran backwards. I didn't stop until I reached the house again and ducked under a table. Outside, I heard more gunshots and then screams. Just barely, I could make out the lifeless corpses of Taehyung and Min Jae. Ji-young and Yuna were nowhere to be seen. Tentatively, I snuck towards the front door and opened it, barreling into my car. Jamming my key in, I turned the ignition, but my heart sank when the engine started and died. I tried again, and once more the car failed to start. With no other options, I took my gun from the glove compartment and hid. So many thoughts ran through my head. Was this real? Am I in a dream? Why am I such a coward? I ran from everything in my life, and I was doing it again. I thought of Yuna, and realized it wasn't fair. She had always helped me at my lowest points, and it was about time I returned the favor. I left the car and ran back into the garden. The first thing I saw was Ji-young, dead, slumped on the floor. Sickeningly, I didn't feel anything but relief. She had been the cause of my sadness, and now she had gotten what she deserved. It was quiet. Too damn quiet. The wind whipped through the cottage, shaking windows and whistling around the room. It seemed almost abandoned, but I knew he was out there somewhere. I didn't think we were gonna make it, but we did. We're safe now, I'm sure.
Frontman 29 has been eliminated. Contestants 67 and 456 have advanced to the next stage. Arrange for their arrival and let the next game commence.
Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition. Basically a long trek throughout woodlands and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight, which is what I would need to do during the real thing, but we hiked 10 miles through woods in a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable. looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, until all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be in his late 70s or perhaps early 80s. Very pale, with liver spots dotting his face and a grey and white comb-over to match. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought is that seeing some guy at this age out in the woods in these clothes and in these weather conditions is that this guy has certainly lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice, though, that puzzled me. He was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He began flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After a minute he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him and continued following the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope. It was probably a 40-degree angle and spanned for at least 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross it so quickly and cleanly. I mean, at that distance it's hard to see any fine detail clearly at all, but I swear he didn't appear wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and was going to try and make my way down, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. "Something's wrong here," he said under his breath. We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started to get irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down at the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services. That professional help would be on its way soon, and they would have all the tools that they needed to help. The old man then got furious and began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right away, or there would be hell to pay. His voice changed drastically at this point. He was now practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets, his skin gone pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came in, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possibly mentally ill man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police so that we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and a pack of supplies like first aid and emergency blankets. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes, and the search lasted a weekend, but there was never any trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date.
For a while, I worked as a 911 call operator. My friend Daniel had just finished his police training and said that the police had some vacancies, so it would pay a decent amount. The only catch was that I'd have to take the late night shifts. Being a broke college student, it was fine by me. Besides, job vacancies were becoming quite rare in those days. Training didn't actually take that long. I just needed to be calm and collected. Soon enough, I passed the test with flying colours and got the job immediately. My first week as a 911 call operator was pretty uneventful. In fact, the first week was pretty boring, if anything. Drunk dialers, the odd medical emergency, nothing too serious like murder or shootings. There were a few other college students there, but I never really got along with them, to be honest. I was just there for a quick buck. The second week, though, was a little different. It was only me. Daniel said that they didn't need as many people anymore, and I was the lucky one to stay. Even more nights spent staring at a blank monitor.
What a drag.
I settled in on a Monday in the third week. The station was basically empty. I poured myself a strong latte and settled in expecting another uneventful night.
911, what's your emergency?
The line was basically second nature to me by then. I heard nothing on the other end for a while. Then I heard a creepy laugh.
Can I order some pizza?
I sighed and ended the call. Prank callers were always annoying, and I was told to reprimand them, but honestly, for minimum wage, I really couldn't be asked. I sipped my latte and looked around. It was really peaceful. I was always introverted, so this was a dream come true. 911, what's your emergency?
I think someone's following me.
I paused. Daniel?
Mike? Yeah, it's me. I'm off duty. But there's this guy that's been following me for a while now. I've turned around 3 corners and he's still after me. I'm alone, Daniel. You gotta help me.
Where are you?
I'm making my way to the station.
Before I could reply, the call cut off. As the call ended, I ran downstairs. Just in case, I took a gun from below the front desk. I returned to my desk and waited again.
911, what's your emergency?
Hello? I said. The call cut off. Another prank call? Literally the worst time for this. I shook it off and tried to get the worrying thoughts out of my head. I crept downstairs, gun at the ready. Slowly, I creaked the door open. I was relieved to see my friend Daniel in his usual blue hoodie and Nike Air Jordans. He was wearing a face mask, so I didn't really notice anything much. But for some reason, there was something slightly off about him. Putting the gun back underneath the desk, I approached my friend.
You had me worried there,
I said.
Nothing bad, he said, pointing a thumb behind. I think he dipped when he saw me come in. I nodded and made my way back up again.
The night shift resumed as usual. An hour had passed and I assumed that Daniel had left. I went downstairs to check.
Sure enough, he had left, but for some odd reason, he left the door wide open.
I rung Daniel from my personal phone to make sure things were okay. He finally picked up. Hey man, did you get home safely?
What are you talking about, Mike? I've been home all day.
My heart skipped a beat. I bolted to the front desk. I frantically looked for the gun, only to realize it was missing. Without thinking, I ran outside in pure panic, freaking out. With shaking hands, I locked the door behind me. When I heard the shallow breathing again, I turned to face him. My suspicions were true. It wasn't Daniel.
It was some crazy psycho posing as him. One of his eyes was visibly twitchy, larger than the other. His skin was pale and drenched in sweat. In his hands, there was the gun. Hey, what the hell's going on? The last thing I remember were those gunshots and that laugh. I remember waking up at the ER the next morning. The doctor told me I was lucky to be alive. The bullets were barely inches away from my heart. No one knows who that crazy psycho was, or where he went, or what he wanted. Fortunately, Daniel was fine and had never come into contact with the man. But every night, I get nightmares about that crazy psycho and how my lack of wariness could have killed me.
I lived in a small town when I was a kid. When I say small, I really do mean small. Only around 40 houses in a small crisscross of streets down a couple of miles from Boston. But we were one happy community. Parents could trust their neighbors to babysit their children for a weekend, mow their lawns, and low on sugar? Don't worry, Carla has some next door. Out of all the kids in the suburb, I had a great friend called Timmy. As Halloween began to roll over, Timmy and I began to work on our costumes. Him a ghost, and me a vampire. Our parents a couple of feet away began talking in hushed whispers. After a while, they came over and told us that a couple of children from the area had gone missing. We were naive little kids, and would ask dumb stuff, like how they just disappeared like that, or if they had invisibility powers. They simply told us to come straight home after school, and to never go to house number 40, or talk to Mr. Odd. We called him Mr. Odd, simply because we didn't know his real name, and well, because he was odd. He seemed to have never taken a shower, and wore the same old drab trench coat with droopy hair and bloodshot eyes that caved into you. The moment the children went missing, Mr. Odd was put to blame. The police were called, and us children watched from the pavement as they busted down his door. Unlike the other houses, number 40 had become uncared for and ancient, crumbling and cracked. It was at the end of the street, this outcast, just like its owner. After a few hours, the police left, having found nothing. But still, the parents of the town kept a watchful eye on the house, and as Halloween finally came by, they released their children carefully into the streets. Before I left, my parents told me to stay overnight at Timmy's place. They had urgent work in the city to attend to, and thought it was safer if I stayed with their family. I was ecstatic about it, and raced outside to meet him. Timmy and I had a method to dry the town of all its sweets. We would start from number 1, and then work our way down. Then, we would come back without our costumes, and see if we could squeeze out any more from these neighbors we knew so well. The one we knew best was Ian. We bumped into him as we began making our way up to our first house. He smiled and waved at us. Timmy caught a glimpse of a purple bracelet on his wrist and asked about it. Ian's smile disappeared into a depressed look. It belonged to Sarah. We apologized to Ian and hurried along our way. Ian's daughter had been one of the missing children, and the topic darkened the mood. Regardless, we made easy pickings of the houses, until eventually, there we were, standing in front of house number 40. I don't remember which one of us came up with the idea of asking there, but determined to not chicken out in front of my friend, I knocked quietly. When there was no answer, I was prepared to spin and bolt, when the door creaked open ever so slightly. Mr. Odd, a ball in hand, held out towards us, full to the brim. Nodding without even saying the traditional line, I only took one, being careful to not look up at his face. Turning around, I began making my way down the steps, when a hand clamped down painfully on my arm. In a raspy voice,
"Be careful out there. A lot of kids going missing, you know."
And that was it. Screaming, I pulled out of his grasp and ran down the street. It was only after a while did I stop, catching my breath. Composing myself, I expected to see Timmy, but no, there was nobody. Panicking, I looked around, desperately trying to see him. Suddenly, a figure appeared from behind. It was Ian. "Hey kid, what's the matter?" I tried telling him what had happened, but it all came out in stammers and gasps. "Calm down, it's safer inside, come on." I entered his house, still looking down the street, expecting to see Timmy at any moment. Sitting me down on his couch, Ian disappeared into the kitchen for a while. He came back with a mug of hot cocoa in hand and set it down on the table. "Drink up, kid. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'll go call the police. Sit tight." As he left, I saw a glimpse of a pistol in his other hand, but I felt safe knowing that Ian was here with me. Not a second later, there was a crash in the kitchen. Shouts of struggles, a bang, and then silence. The blood drained from my face, and I instinctively rushed to the door. Turning the knob, I began screaming as I realized it was locked. The world became drowsy around me, my vision unclear. Sprinting into another room, bumping into things along the way, I opened another door only to stumble downwards. I was in the basement and fumbled along the wall, hoping to find a light. I eventually found a switch, flicking it on, and the sight before me curdled my stomach. Piles of corpses stacked upon one another. Some faces were familiar to me, like Patty Grangerson from school, or Danny Lewis, who played on the same football team as me. I vomited when I saw Sarah. The last body was Timmy. His throat had been opened up to a sickly red smile, his ghost costume streaked with blood. The last thing I saw was Mr. Odd, looking down at me with a puzzled look. Then, nothingness. I woke up the next morning to sirens and flashing lights. My parents were there on either side of me, as I lay in an ambulance, hoping that it was all just a dream. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Ian's house was searched, and they found all of the missing children in there. Well, most of them. A few of them were missing body parts. A psychopath had been living across my street, and I never realized it. And I never saw Timmy's parents again. Whenever I would ask my parents, they would just sigh and shake their heads. Mr. Odd still lives down the road. He doesn't bother nobody, and nobody bothers him. But every time I remember Sarah's bracelet, or the last moments I saw Timmy, I can't help but cry in delight. Yeah, you heard me right? I mean, who else could have helped Ian? The three boys gathered on the sidewalk. It was almost midnight. They went to the Halloween parade and continued having fun while plotting to scare others. On the sidewalk, there was the front of a hospital. The three of them stood under the morgue window. However, the window was at a considerable height, but there was a tree which they planned to climb up to look inside. Gerardo saw a lady turn a corner and walk towards them. "People are coming," he warned the others, and immediately looked away. "We have to wait for it to happen," said another of the boys. The lady was crossing slowly. Then she seemed to remember. She looked at the window and quickened her pace. In the city, almost everyone had heard some frightening story about that window. Mainly, it was said that some apparitions were observed from there by people passing by on the sidewalk. It was also said that a scary voice called people by their name and laughed. The lady entered the other block. Seeing that the street was deserted, they made up their minds. "Who goes up first?" asked one of them. "Me," said Gerardo. He looked at the tree, lifted a foot to a low branch, and began to climb. The others watched him, turned to the end of the street and looked at each other, trying to guess the degree of fear each felt. Gerardo reached window level. He then gripped the window with both of his arms. With his feet, he braced on a branch that trembled under his weight. Then, he looked towards the morgue. The first thing he saw was the autopsy table, which was empty. Next to it were 4 gurney tables, and on one of them, covered with a sheet, was a body. Gerardo was looking at it, when suddenly, the body straightened up to sit. He then pulled the sheet off with his hands, and Gerardo saw that the dead man looked just like him, and the dead man looked at him and pointed. Gerardo shuddered so much that his feet slipped, and when he let go of the trunk, he fell to the ground and hit his head, dying on the spot. An hour and a half later, Gerardo was inside the morgue, and they put him on that very table.
This happened a long time ago. I'm guessing back in 2006. I couldn't have been older than 4 at the time. Yet I vividly remember the fear I felt during this encounter. It was an early summer morning, and the sun was coming up. But few people were out. In fact, the streets were practically dead that morning. My mum decided to take my sister, a 1-year-old, seated in a stroller, and I to throw away some garbage at the garbage station. I might add that the garbage station is kind of secluded from nearby houses, bordering one of those deep, dark forests of eastern Sweden. Since I was only 4 when this happened, the memories from the incident have faded a lot. However, my mum remembers it all. She says that upon entering the garbage station, she immediately got an eerie feeling of being watched. I remember feeling it too. I felt creeped out, even though I didn't know why I was scared. I guess I could just sense my mum's fear. Walking along the secluded garbage station, my mum suddenly stopped and told me this: "Hold on to the stroller as hard as you can, and don't let go no matter what." That is my most vivid memory I have of this, and I don't think I'll ever forget those words. I'll at least never forget how they made me feel. It was as if my blood turned to ice. I just froze. My mum sounded stern, but even a toddler can sense when someone's scared shitless. My mum was definitely afraid of something. The rest is just a blur. I don't remember much, apart from the aforementioned. So I'll let the rest of the story be told from the perspective of my mother. This is the recollection of her experience, recalled to the best of my abilities but in my own words. Not far from where we were standing, a truck was parked with a man seated in the front. There was nothing unusual. A lot of truck drivers stopped to rest by the side of the road. But this man was staring. He wouldn't stop staring. He stared right at me, examining my body, with the determined gaze of a predator. Gluing the 3 of us in his sight, he truly seemed pleased by the fear he'd instilled in our faces. And his eyes, they were something else. Almost as if they didn't belong to a human, but rather a predator of the savannah. I felt like prey, stuck in the claws of a lion. I just couldn't move. That's when he smiled at me. I remember that smile. Dead, cold, calculating eyes to go along with it, and the way he licked his lips, almost as if to say, "I could kill you if I wanted to." I believe this was the point in time, into the strange encounter, when my mum told me to hold onto the stroller, tightly, and not let go. My mum is a small woman, standing at 160 centimeters and weighing barely 45 kilos, and could easily have been overpowered by the overweight man in the truck. My mum later admitted she was afraid he would jump out and knock her out, possibly assaulting her, or even kidnapping me or my 1-year-old sister. We bolted out of there. We didn't throw away much garbage that morning. We just turned around and walked home as quickly as we could, as a mum can with a stroller and a 4-year-old and toddler. We never spoke about what happened that day up until very recently. This incident lingered somewhere in the back of my mind as that weird thing that happened when I was a child, and every time I walk past that garbage station, I get a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. As previously mentioned, this happened around 2006. Fast forward to 2008. The face of a 10-year-old girl called Engla was printed across the front page of every newspaper in sight. She had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered. And the perpetrator was an overweight truck driver by the name of Anders Elkland, now known as one of Sweden's most infamous killers. Anders Elkland was charged with the murder of Engla, alongside the rape and murder of a woman called Pernilla. He was also suspected of abducting another little girl who's still missing, making him a pedophile, a serial rapist, and serial killer. My mum says that when she saw Elkland's picture in the paper, especially when she saw those cold, familiar eyes, she knew he was the creepy man from the garbage station that early morning, all those years ago. Thinking how my mum, or my sister, or me, all of us could have been his victims, sends chills up my spine. Anders, even though you're behind bars, let's never meet again.
It's been a month since my best friend Tyler disappeared, without a trace. Nobody's seen him since, and as every day passes, his family becomes more and more convinced that their son will never come home. Of course, I'm relatively sad as well, but he'd slept with my girlfriend. We made up, but our friendship was just never the same. But when he vanished, I was the first to look for him. I organized massive searches, put up flyers, and even spoke on television, urging anyone to come forward with information. We were finally relieved when we found a note. The note read, "Hey guys, I know it's sudden, but I'm going on a journey of self-improvement, so there's nothing to worry about. I hope you guys aren't mad, and I hope you understand. X, Tyler." I still miss him regardless, but it's good to know that he's still out there, enjoying life, I think. One particular day, I went to the shower as soon as I came back from school. However, nothing would ease the pounding headache I had, so I decided to take a walk to soothe myself, to recompose, and just take in the sights for a second. I opened the door and stepped outside. My favorite place to go was the local woods, where Tyler and I would spend our younger days, fighting off space aliens or holding cowboy duels. Back then, when times were simple, the world was like our playground. We would play all day long without a care. For about 5 minutes, I followed the worn path while the wind was picking up intensity. I took a sharp left and went down a hill, almost stumbling a couple of times. But the headache seemed to feel less angry and less painful. I eventually came across a hole in the ground and sat down next to it. Nearby, a shovel was stabbed into the ground. "You know you didn't have to make me do this," I said, taking out a lighter. I perched a cigarette on the edge of my mouth.
I made you do this?
"Yeah, you did."
But why? Are you f***ing serious? You know what you did!
I struck a spark, cupping a hand over the cigarette and lighting it. For a while, we were silent. "I trusted you." I looked down into the hole. A skeleton was all that was left of my best friend, a fistful of maggots feasting away at the flesh that remained. The stench was awful, but I was feeling fine. In fact, better than before. My headache was replaced by a clear-headed clarity. "Wipe yourself off, dude."
Oh wait, you're dead.
I stopped and stood back up, throwing the cigarette into the hole. I picked up the shovel and began to cover up Tyler. I still remember the last words on his lips.
Please, no, don't do it, please.
I made my way home, through the twisting branches, a plan formulating in my head. I opened the basement door to find my girlfriend waiting for me, her eyes shifting. She's been acting a little weird recently. I feel like she knows. The plan has become clear now. One more hole in the woods wouldn't hurt, right?
My name is Jason, and it happened during quarantine, 2 months after I finished year 11. Everything seemed to slow to an aching halt due to the coronavirus pandemic. I wasted away in my confined bedroom as the internet swallowed up my whole life. My hobby was rather erratic, to say the least. Instead of gaming online or productively searching through articles, I somehow ended up getting more and more into the deep, dark web. Human sacrifices, satanic rituals, and things that were horribly indescribable. I'd spend days and nights completely fixated to my screen. Sometimes I'd go days without sleeping. My concept of time had completely gone. One day I stumbled upon a shady website, asking me for my email address. It promised me that I would have the sweetest dreams. Now most people would think straight, but being my stupid self, I signed up. A week after this occurrence, my parents were called away to London for a business meeting. They were having a frustrating time with their business, so it was pretty urgent. The moment I heard the car leave the driveway, I booted up my PC, eager to surf the dark web again, only to be peppered with notifications. My heart started to beat like a drum. Laying before me were 2 emails. I opened up the first. It only included a link to a Facebook page, though the sender, oddly enough, didn't have a username or a picture. I obliged and clicked the link. Plastered on every feed was my face. Some of them had been twisted and contorted into horrific shapes. For a while I just sat there. Cold sweat dripped down my forehead. I tried to laugh it off. It had to be my friends trolling me, right? But then again, I barely had any. I opened the second message. I felt just about ready to hurl as flashing lights and cheap animations flooded my screen, combining into a nauseating mix. The joke was going way too far now. I clicked the X button, but it simply wouldn't go. God damn it, I shouted. I slammed my desk, and suddenly the screen shut off. I was drowned in complete darkness. The clock read 12:08, and I once again just sat. Any attempt to turn the computer back on failed. I shook it off and went inside my duvet, trying to forget about what happened. A thud. I thought it came from my window, but no, this wasn't from my window. No, these were heavy footsteps, making their way through the house and onto the stairs. I panicked and slammed my door shut. I didn't know what to do as I was home alone, and it didn't make things better that we live in an isolated part of town. Who the hell was it, and what the hell did they want? Was it the guy who sent me the email? At this point, I was literally pissing my pants. I'm calling the police. Get the hell away from me, I cried. No answer. I'm warning you. I turned to my phone. My heart sank as the icon read, no service. The footsteps continued. Every step taken filled me with utter dread. The feet made their way into the hallway. I desperately searched around for something to defend myself with, and tears started to stream down my face. Get the hell away from me! I turned on the computer. At the sound of the startup, the footsteps ceased right in front of the door. As I took a shallow breath, a large axe smashed a hole through the door. I screamed in terror as the door came crashing down. A figure shrouded in a trench coat, slick with blood and gore, towered before me. But what I saw next is something that will always haunt me till the day I die. All over his face were deep open cut wounds, filled with worms and maggots eating through his flesh. The man's large hand outstretched in front of my face, and before I knew it, I blacked out. I jerked awake in a cold sweat and looked around, realizing that it was just a dream. I turned to my clock just as the time went from 12:07 to 12:08. Then I heard the heavy footsteps again.
The scratching noise. Kevin lived in a small apartment downtown. The walls were fairly thin, so he was used to hearing his neighbors sometimes. One night, he heard an unfamiliar sound. It was like a scraping in the walls. He figured it was the new neighbors and gave them a break. The noise went away after a few minutes, and he was able to go to sleep. The next day, he walked past them in the hallway. They had a nice chat. He learned they just finished moving in yesterday, so he was right. They were the cause of the sound. They talked a little more before he had to get to work. Everything went back to normal for about a week. Then, at the same time as before, the sound happened again. It was soft at first, then grew into a repetitive scratching noise, almost like someone was doing a long, scraping motion against the walls. It was loud enough that it woke him up. He went to bang his fist on the wall to tell whoever it was to stop. Before he could even bring his fist down, the sound disappeared. He flopped his arm down and shrugged it off. In the morning, he went to get dressed but noticed something. His closet door was cracked open. He thought he closed it the night before. Cautiously, he opened it. There was nothing different about it. Everything looked exactly the same. He laughed it off and got dressed. After that, things were normal for 2 weeks. One night, he came home drunk and went straight to bed. He had a dream. It was dark, but he felt hot. There was sweat dripping down his face. His arms and legs felt like they were restrained. He started to panic as the scraping sound returned. It filled his ears until it was the only thing he could hear. Kevin shot out of bed. Sunlight was coming in through the window. He realized it was just a dream and took a shaky breath. Then, he looked over and saw his closet door was wide open. He always closed his closet door and remembered back to the one day where it was slightly open. He let it go at the time because sometimes it just doesn't latch. This time, there was no reason for the door to be open that wide. Then he remembered he was drunk last night, so maybe he opened it and just blacked out. He wasn't wearing any different clothes than the day before, though. He was a little shaken, but decided to forget about it. He got up to close the door and nurse his hangover. 1 month passed before there was another incident. It was pitch black in Kevin's bedroom, and he was dead asleep. The scratching noise started one more time, but it didn't wake him up. It lasted a few minutes, and then slowly faded away. Then, the doorknob to his closet twisted open. A thin beam of light shone into his room. It widened as the door opened. A shadow, in the shape of a person, stood centered in the light. Kevin shifted in his sleep. His eyes began to flutter open as the shadow walked towards him. Before he could react, he was hit on the head. The first thing he felt before he even opened his eyes was heat. It was dark, but he could make out vague shapes. It seemed like he was in a very small space. He tried to move, but realized his arms and legs were tied down. Then he heard something. It sounded like someone was walking towards him. Suddenly, a light turned on. It blinded him for a second, even though it was just a small lamp. The first thing he saw was wall slats. He was inside the walls of his apartment building. Something was in his closet. He also noticed strange words and symbols carved all over the walls. Was that the reason for the scratching noise? He squinted at the walls as his eyes adjusted to the light. The shadow stepped out in front of him. It was his new neighbor. Kevin's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe what was going on. The neighbor laughed at his expression. "I'm not who you think I am." Its face began to twist and bend. Its body contorted, changing size and shape. When it stood up straight again, Kevin was looking at himself. "I am a shapeshifter. I ate your neighbor and took their shape. And now you're next." Before he could scream, the shapeshifter gagged him, uttered, "I'll be back," and walked towards the hole in his closet.
I had just moved out of a share house in the suburbs and into my own crappy one-bedroom apartment in the city. I am a male, and at the time was around 25 years old. My apartment, while old and small, was located about 500 meters from one of the most popular night spots in the inner city. As I was in my mid-20s and out on my own, this was the perfect place for me. This was because my friends and I were quite social and would frequent bars and nightclubs in the city, and the taxi fares were starting to add up. Also, this new apartment was close to my work, so the move made sense. I got settled in right away and invited my friends over for pre-drinks before hitting the clubs. Due to the limited space in the apartment, this means that some friends were inside and some were drinking on the walkway just out front. We had the music up and had just started drinking, but between songs I could hear the couple next door arguing. Now the apartment was old and crappy, which meant thin walls as well, so I pressed an ear to the wall in order to listen. I hadn't met any of my new neighbors at the time, as I didn't take too long in moving in, and I didn't see anyone during. I was curious. Judging from what I could determine while eavesdropping, there were a gay couple in their early 30s. One of the men was yelling at the other to go next door and tell us to keep it down. The other was arguing that it was just a housewarming and to let it go for the night. Since I didn't want to cause too much trouble, I marshaled everyone outside to start making our way to the club, leaving my new neighbors in peace. Later that night, I came home alone as I was tired from the move and decided to let my friends carry on partying without me. I arrived at my door and proceeded to fumble around for my keys, when I looked up to see a man standing on the walkway in front of the next-door apartment smoking a cigarette. He was tall and thin with brown, oily hair. I noticed that he had a cut lip and a faded but still visible black eye. "Good day," I said. "Sorry about the noise earlier," correctly assuming he was my neighbor. He replied, "Nah, you're right, mate. I'm Chris," and he shook my hand. I noticed his knuckles were red and a little bit scratched up, so I knew something was off. I apologized for the noise and said, "I hope I didn't cause any trouble for you." He withdrew his hand with a soft but cracking voice and said, "Nah, it's all right. Rick just gets a bit cranky sometimes, I'm used to it." With that, I finished off the conversation and told Chris that I'd see him later. It was about 2 a.m. at this point, and I just wanted to sleep. but couldn't help worrying about the potential domestic abuse going on next door. I decided to keep an eye on it for now, as I didn't have all the info. For all I knew, he could have gotten into a fight with someone else. As the weeks passed, I noticed that my new neighbors got drunk regularly and would argue almost every time. I could tell that Rick was the dominant one, as his voice was a lot deeper and Chris seemed to be afraid of him during their shouting matches. This is why I kept my distance and never really socialized with them. I would even overhear them arguing about me, and that Rick thought that Chris liked me, etc. I would just tune out all of this with headphones and video games, not to mention an active social life and full-time work to keep me occupied. I did find myself avoiding having guests over because of the neighbors. I would opt to meet people out, as their arguments would be quite upsetting. This was working out fine enough until Christmas Eve that year. I was arriving home after having come from some last-minute Christmas shopping. I was getting ready for a night of present wrapping as I was to visit my family the following day for Christmas. As I arrive home, I noticed 2 police cars outside and Anna, an Asian woman who lived a few apartments up from Chris, screaming. I asked her what happened, and all she said was, "It's just so sad," while sobbing. I could see 3 officers trying to restrain someone, and there was blood on their uniform. I came just a little bit closer to see Chris's oily brown hair in the center of the affray. His face was bleeding from his jaw where he had apparently been slashed by something sharp. They got him to his feet, and I could see that his cheek had been cut so deep the skin was flapping open as he struggled and resisted with the police. I recoiled in shock, and I went to comfort Anna, who was crying uncontrollably at this point. Suddenly, Rick's voice boomed out of nowhere.
"You see what you've done? You loser, just kill yourself!"
This frightened me, and my instinct was to get me and Anna to safety. Even though the cops were here, they had their hands full with Chris, and I certainly didn't want to get involved in such an ugly fight where knives were involved. Anna refused to come with me and said she would be fine. I looked around to see where Rick was, and he kept yelling at Chris the whole time. The 3 cops struggled to restrain him, and I could hear Chris whimpering apologetically in between. I couldn't see where Rick was, so I decided to just go to my apartment and lock the door. As I turned to go, I froze, as Rick's voice boomed.
"Where do you think you're going?"
A chill went down my spine as my brain struggled to reconcile the fact that these words were coming from Chris's mouth. I felt panic grip me as I realized that all this time Rick and Chris were the same person. All the fighting, laughing, drinking, and carry on that I couldn't help overhearing the last couple of months had come from one solitary person, a lonely guy in his small 1-bedroom apartment. For some reason this made me feel sick. I later learned from Anna that this wasn't the first time the police had come out to take Chris away. Anna explained that he spent a few months at the local psychiatric hospital each time. His father owned the apartment, so it was here waiting for him when he got out. I moved out a few months later, and while it's a sad situation for Chris, I really do feel for him.
I was a fresh-faced graduate from high school. The summer before I left for UT, I took a construction job. I had a full scholarship for my first 2 years, but having a full wallet would help pay for the small things. Most of the other guys were friendly and entertaining. A day didn't pass where we weren't doubled over in laughter because of something someone did or said. 2 of the guys were exceptionally funny. Mark and Daniel had been working on separate sites or together for the past 15 years. They were both grade A practical jokers, but sometimes Mark would take things a little too far. Daniel was more than often the target of his humor. This would become a source of tension between the 2, but they always made up by the end of the workday. As you may expect, eventually Mark's joking would go too far for Daniel to overlook. That day just happened to be on my final week on the job. For some time, everyone on the site had noticed Daniel wasn't himself. He spent long periods of time somewhere talking on his phone. When he wasn't gone, he seemed constantly agitated. His usual happy-go-lucky manner had disappeared. We'd all tried our best to make him laugh, but nothing had worked. Not even Mark could do it. As time went on, we all began to believe his troubles were about his girlfriend. When Mark heard about this, he couldn't stop himself from poking at this sore spot. On this day, Daniel had gone on the phone, and when he came back, Mark started joking around. "What's wrong, Danny boy? Are you having troubles at home? Is your old lady getting the bone from the mailman?" The verbal jabs only served to annoy Daniel even further. He said nothing. Instead, he just stared at Mark like he was going to burn through him with his eyes. Mark wasn't going to let his bad mood get in the way of getting a laugh. After lunch and throughout the rest of the day, Mark continued on with his jokes. Daniel, a guy who usually said something when he was fed up, held his tongue the whole day. I knew if he didn't put a stop to Mark's poking, he would take things too far and cause a problem, maybe even a fight, I thought. Daniel was clearly not in any mood to let the remarks roll off his back. And as quitting time arrived, I relaxed. I was almost sure Mark would let up. Unfortunately, things only got worse. A lot worse. It was quitting time. We were going around the site picking up our tools and cleaning any trash we'd left behind. Everyone was focused on the task at hand. I was off in my own little world, thinking about any last-minute things I needed to do before I left for school. When everything was complete, we were all standing around discussing our plans for the forthcoming weekend. It had been a while since Mark had made any jokes, and I assumed he'd stop for the day. When his turn came, he looked very serious and said, "Well, I think since old Danny's going fishing, I'll go over to his place and give his old lady some boning." The joke had come by complete surprise to all of us, and we all fell over ourselves laughing. All but Daniel, of course. I saw a snarl appear across his face. His teeth were gritted so tightly it looked like they'd crumble any second.
"I'm so sick of your stupid jokes."
No sooner had he said this, Daniel stepped forward with his hammer drawn back. I was precariously close to Mark at the time. I stumbled back so quickly I fell onto my butt. I looked up just as Daniel brought the claw end of the hammer into Mark's skull. Mark immediately fell over seizing. Writhing around the floor, I was in shock, and I froze where I was. I watched Daniel for his next move. He stood over Mark's convulsing body for a moment, surveying his handiwork, I suppose. I was relieved when he calmly walked over to a bench and just sat down. I don't think I could have moved had he come at me. Just like me, the other guys were frozen in place watching as Mark's body slowly came to a limp halt. And we all looked at each other, too terrified to speak. Daniel broke the silence for us. I guess y'all should call the cops. I'm not gonna run off or anything, I'm just a little fed up. The resignation in his voice showed just how far gone he was. The old Daniel I knew wouldn't have done anything like this. We did like he asked, and he didn't give the cops any trouble when it came time to take him away. I thought the shock was affecting me at that moment, but even now, I don't feel anything but sorry for Daniel. It would come out later just how bad things had been going on at home. His girlfriend at the time had cheated on him more than once. She had blamed it all on him, and he had been working 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep her happy and keep up with expenses. He was neck deep in love and too blind to realize what was happening until it already had happened. After all he did to give her what she wanted, she had the nerve to complain about him being gone so much. When he was at work, all he could think about was, is she with another guy right now? He was too private to share any of this with us. I don't think Mark had any idea what was truly occurring. He took a shot, and when he saw that he'd hit a nerve, he rode it into the ground. And he did that a lot, and I suppose this turned out to be one too many. I'm sometimes still in shock when I sit back and think about how quickly his life left his body. even in those last few convulsing moments.
Someone pretended to be my father and tried to break into our house. A little context. My dad and I live together in our own multi-family home in Germany. My dad has a serious lung condition. His lungs produce and trap an excessive amount of mucus. The trapped amount is huge and keeps his lungs from working correctly. It's pretty normal that he has to be picked up by an ambulance every 2 to 3 weeks because he can't breathe anymore. Last week, it was that time of the month. He couldn't breathe, so I called an ambulance. Soon, he was taken to the closest hospital. Pretty normal for me, because this happened at least 10 times in the last 6 months. So I went to bed after he got picked up on Tuesday. I went to work the next morning and got a text from him that he had to stay for at least 2 more days, approximately until Friday. On Wednesday evening, I got home from work and played a match of Rogue Company, when someone suddenly rang the doorbell. That's unusual, because we never have unannounced visitors. I walked to the door and was about to press the door buzzer to open the main door, when I heard more than one voice directly in front of my door. That meant that someone just got past the main door. Weird. I asked in German, "Hello? Who is it?" Silence for 3 seconds. Then a person who sounded like my father answered,
Mitcha, it's me. I forgot my keys. Open the door.
I thought, okay, in that case. Wait a minute. My dad never calls me Mitcha, only Mitchy, and there was that sarcastic tone in that voice. I didn't trust the situation, so I called my father on his phone. If the person at the front door was my father, his phone should ring, right? Right, it didn't. Big whoop. My father answered, and as I suspected, he was still in the hospital. Meanwhile, the 2 people on the other side of the door heard my phone call and started kicking my door.
Let me in, Mitcha. It's your daddy. Let me in.
Thank God that door is reinforced. After I threatened them with calling police and having a big-ass knife in my hand, they left. I heard their footsteps running down the staircase. I rushed to a window facing in the street to check if I could see a car or a license plate. Nothing. Just a few footsteps in the distance. They never came back after that. What's weird is that they knew my name and that my father wasn't home, despite his car standing in the driveway. Shit was hitting the fan when a buddy reported something similar. We called the police. Investigation in progress. I love being a gentleman, and I can't help it. I love opening doors for women and letting them go through first. It sickens me how the art of being a gentleman has gone down in society. My mother taught me how to be a gentleman from a very young age, and I pride myself in being the best kind of gentleman. I remember opening a door for a woman to walk through, and she started smiling. It was clear that she hadn't been treated like that in a long time. As she walked through the door, she realized that she had ended up in the most horrid place. She was in a room with a murderer. Another time, it was a busy day, and taxis were being whistled and called at by many people. I decided to get a taxi for a woman who was patiently waiting for one, and I even opened the door for her. She smiled, and it was clear that she had never been treated like this before, and was really grateful. She got into the taxi, and when I had closed the door, she knew that she had entered a car that she didn't want to enter anymore. As the car sped away, she screamed, and I was proud of myself for being a gentleman. Another time, in a university lecture, there was a female student who had to bring her baby with her. The baby was crying, so I decided to carry it for a little while. The woman was very grateful. Then I got out of the lecture room with the baby still in my arms. And to this day, I honestly can't remember where I put that baby. The basement. Just a few months ago, everything was normal. Every day was a usual boring day with my parents, but I was happy. My parents were going out a lot late at night, but I figured they just needed some time alone. One day, when they were out and I was alone in the house, I went to the kitchen to grab some food. I heard some weird noises from the basement, but I thought I was just really tired. On my way back to my room, I heard something again. This time, it was loud and clear. I heard the crying of a little girl from the basement. I got really freaked out because I always believed in the paranormal. Immediately, I thought it must be a ghost or something. I ran back to my room and locked the door as fast as I could. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to wait until my parents came home. It felt like hours, but they were probably back in an hour. They were trying to be quiet because they thought I was asleep. Just when I wanted to open my door and tell them what happened, I heard my father say something that shocked me. "Let's see how our little friend is doing in the basement." I was very confused and I didn't know what to think. I heard them as they were going downstairs, so I decided to follow. I was trying to be as quiet as I could. Slowly, I opened the basement door so I could hear them better before going down. I heard my parents laughing and the crying again, but this time it wasn't as loud as before. I was more and more quiet and the laughing got louder and louder. Finally, I gathered some courage and decided to check what's going on. I went down a few steps on the stairs, just enough to see a bit more. I will never forget what I saw. There was a little girl just barely alive on the ground. She had several stab wounds. She didn't even have enough life in her to scream, but I could see the suffering in her eyes. My parents were kissing each other, and then my father asked, "Are you ready for the big finale?" My mum just nodded her head and kissed him again. My father pulled out a drill from a toolbox and grabbed the little girl's neck. He looked at her for a few seconds, and then he started to drill into her head. I looked away just in time as tears ran down my face. My parents were just laughing as my father continued to do the deed. The little girl died in a few seconds, and then I recognized her. I had seen her in the news a few days ago. She was missing for 2 weeks, and the police were looking for her. I wanted to go back to my room to call the police. I was disgusted by my parents, and I never wanted to see them again. I slipped as I was going up the stairs, and they heard me. I started to run to my room, and my father was running after me. He told me to stop, and he would explain everything. I ran faster than ever in my life, and finally got to my room. I closed the door, and then I pushed the bookshelf to barricade the door. I dialed 911, but then I froze. I hung up the phone, and I didn't know what to do. I hated my parents, and I knew what they deserved, but they were still my parents. I was just sitting there for hours. It was really odd that my parents didn't even try to come in. One time, my father knocked on the door and told me to forgive them one day, but that's it. I only realized how long I was sitting there when I saw the sun rising. Finally, I dialed 911 again, and I explained everything. In 20 minutes, the police arrived, and I shouted, "I'm here. I'm the one who called you." They knocked on my door and told me it was safe to come out. I waited outside with 2 police officers while the rest of them were searching the house. I told them about the body in the basement, but when they came back, they told me there were not 1, but 3 bodies. I realized my father knocked on my door to ask for forgiveness because they already knew that it was the only way out. A few months have passed, but I'm reliving the whole thing every night. I went to several psychologists, but nothing helps. At least, I thought nothing helps. But now I understand. that there's only one way out for me too. Exit 24. It's almost strange how driving at night gets less magical every time you do it. The first time you look at the lights of the cities and other cars and gaze at the stars through the front window. After the millionth time, however, it all gets indifferent. Everything fades in the background just like it would do in daylight. The lights don't stand out anymore. They're just a part of the scenery, like cities are, while seen from a distance during the day. The magic of the night seems to disappear over time. This is how I felt while driving home. Me and my fiancée had just moved into our first house, and it was a beautiful moment for me and Zoe to finally enter the house while it was under our ownership. However, the stress of the moving soon caught up with us, as getting all our things to the new house was a long and tedious operation. On the first night, we were done with moving everything. However, Zoe had already forgotten something. Apparently her beauty case had been left at her parents' house on the other side of the country. I tried to convince her that it could wait a night, but she told me it was way too important for that, and since I was the only one with a car, I should go. Not wanting an argument on our first night in the house, I agreed and hopped in my car, off to be a hero and get that beauty case. The ride to my in-laws' house went on without trouble. My trusty old Audi had given me no trouble, and the radio actually played some decent music, making the drive very tolerable. Although the drive started while there was still plenty daylight. At the time I arrived at my destination, the sun had disappeared behind the horizon, and only the moonlight guided my path to the driveway of the house. Zoe's father was quite irritated with the disturbance, but her mother completely understood the predicament and quickly grabbed the case. They gave me a bottle of water for on the way, and with that, I was on the road again. That month, I had driven through the night countless times, so the magic of it was completely gone. I drove mindlessly, just trying to get home in a reasonable amount of time. Unfortunately, my surroundings weren't the only thing I wasn't paying attention to, and soon, my fuel meter was getting very close to the E. "Not now, not now!" But yelling doesn't add fuel to the car, so I was frantically looking for a gas station. Finally, I saw an exit and immediately took it. This apparently was exit 24, although the previous exit was 12. And that wasn't the only weird thing. It had a sign saying there was a gas station, but it seemingly went into a forest. However, I didn't have time to worry about where the road went, or the numbering of exits. I just needed some gas, and fast. I looked in my mirror and saw that a big SUV had taken the exit too. This reassured me a bit, as I wasn't alone anymore. A corner in the road came, a corner I had wished I never took. Around the corner, it seemed like I had driven into a new hellish world. The entire forest seemed to be on fire. All the trees except from the ones near the road were burning, coloring the sky red. How the hell did I not see this while on the highway? Just as I said that, the screams began. Sounds of people being tortured and gruesomely murdered came from everywhere in the forest, without seeing anyone causing the sound. I checked my mirror and the SUV was still there, so I wasn't the only one. I checked the road again and immediately slammed the brakes. In front of me lied hundreds of corpses in the middle of the road. All were horribly mutilated and blocked. They were laid on the road perfectly, but it now seemed like the screaming had stopped. The sight of all these bodies was too much, so I grabbed my phone to call the police. Strangely enough, the call didn't connect me to the National Police, but to a local bureau. Still, police were police. I told the operator everything I saw, saying I needed help soon. However, the operator stayed calm, almost like she had experience with this particular situation.
Where is your location?
Somewhere near exit 24.
Okay, no matter what, stay in the car and keep on driving.
The guy from the SUV had gotten out and was now trying to contact me. I rolled down my window and immediately regretted it.
What are you thinking? You could have caused a crash with braking like that. What kind of moron are you?
I pointed to the bodies all over the road. He looked shocked for a minute, but after that, it was back to the insults.
Who is that guy?
The operator asked, apparently having heard his voice. Some guy who was behind me while I braked for the bodies. He's now yelling at me.
Wait, is he out of his vehicle?
Yes, why? I couldn't even finish my sentence.
Ah,
I was still wondering why it was a problem that he was out of his car when it happened. A black void-like arm came out of the flaming forest and grabbed the guy by the stomach. He screamed loudly while being taken to the forest. Then, his gigantic car behind me was picked up and tossed away like a coin.
Sir, what happened?
That guy behind me, he just got f***ing dragged into the forest by some black arm.
I knew this would happen. Alright, listen to me. Drive now. The gas station you're looking for is only a mile away from your location. Just drive. Please.
She didn't have to tell me twice, and I pressed the gas pedal. With the tire smoke, I screeched off, with the screaming starting again. Now, one voice louder. As soon as I passed through the bodies, they seemed to vanish into thin air. I arrived at the gas station, which was indeed there. The second I arrived there, the fires and the screams seemed to instantly stop. It was a very modern and clean facility, in sharp contrast with the landscape I had just driven through. Luckily, there was no one there, so I filled up my car, paid, and drove away. I almost screamed with happiness when I got back on the highway and saw other cars around me. The terror was finally over. I arrived home around 3 a.m, where Zoe was still awake.
Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost,
she said, while I put down the case. There was a large car crash. Lots of blood and ambulances. Not a pretty sight. I lied.
Oh yeah, that's not fun. Well anyways, thank you for bringing my beauty case.
Yay, I'm a hero now. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to bed. Zoe laughed, but I couldn't. Since the experience, I've tried multiple forms of therapy, but nothing seems to truly help. I can now put the event somewhat out of my mind, but every time I have to drive at night, I make sure my fuel tank is 100% full, and every time I look at that bottle my in-laws gave me, full of vaporized water, I think of that night and all the horrible events that happened. My husband went missing 3 months ago, but something still occupies his side of the bed. As I lay down in bed for the night, a heavy pit of dread fills my stomach. Maybe it won't visit tonight. Maybe this will be the night I can finally get some rest. I shut my eyes, and after a long time of thinking, I finally drift off into an uneasy sleep. As usual, my dreams are plagued with countless horrific scenarios about what may have been the cause of my husband's disappearance. The first dream starts off the way it always does. We're standing at the top of the hiking trail my husband and I used to walk before he disappeared, the place where he proposed to me. We sit down and enjoy the lunch we've brought. Everything is fine, like it always is, until he pulls a bottle of red wine from the cooler. Don't drink it, I try to say, but the words in my mind never reach my lips. He opens the bottle and sips. I stare at him, praying this dream has a different ending. But of course it doesn't. It never does. His red-stained lips fall into a frown. Poison, he says, simply, and he falls to the ground. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing as I try and catch my breath. I check the time. It's 12 a.m. It won't be here yet. Again, I allow myself to fall into an uneasy sleep. I enter the second dream, and again, I'm disturbed by the familiarity of it. I am driving to the hospital with lunch for my husband.
Between all his duties as a plastic surgeon, it can be difficult for him to find time to grab lunch. I enter the hospital and it's completely empty. It's dark too, except for a bright light at the end of the corridor. I shouldn't go in there, but I'm not in control of my body. I arrive and open the door. My husband is lying in bed, with bandages and bruises all over his body. A man I've never seen before enters the room behind me.
"We've made some improvements,"
is all he says, and the room goes dark. I wake up once more and stare at the clock beside my bed. 2 a.m. it says. It won't be here yet. I fall asleep once more, and the third dream enters my mind. This one is my least favorite. The illusion of normality always tricks me. I am home, making dinner for myself. I'm alone when there comes a hard, urgent knock at the door. I hate this part, and I don't want to open the door. But once more, I am not in control of my body. I walk slowly towards the door, and with a heavy sigh, I open it. It's my husband. I am overcome with joy. I reach to hug him, but when I do, I realize something that makes my heart drop. Why would he knock if this is his own home? He always comes straight in. Never once has he knocked for me to let him in. Only guests knock. I pull away, and once I do, his face changes into a sad, wounded look. "I thought you'd be happy I'm home," he says. And finally, I wake up once more. I check the clock. 3:59 a.m. It will be here soon. I shut my eyes and hold my breath. I've learnt that if I can stay still, make no noise, it will go away. The clock strikes 4 a.m. and the door to my bedroom opens, like clockwork. Heavy footsteps find their way to the other side of the bed, and I feel its weight next to me. Not a word, not a sound, just the slow and steady sound of breathing next to me. I shut my eyes. Don't move, don't breathe, don't think, I remind myself. I stay this way for a while, and I feel it rise from the bed, and hear its footsteps head back towards the door. I feel relieved and almost let out a sigh, but doing so would blow my cover. But then I feel a tickle in my nose. No, this can't be happening. I try so hard to contain it. I stay frozen, praying it hasn't heard me, but of course, it has. I sit up in bed, clutching my bedsheets tightly in my fist.
"What do you want?" I shout. "Why do you keep coming here?"
It turns to face me, and the ambient light allows me to make out the feature of its face. It looks familiar. The same wounded look as in my dream comes across its face.
"I thought you'd be happy I'm home,"
the thing says. But unlike in my dreams, I will not allow myself to be deceived. It is not my husband. The clock ticks. I sit there in the chair in a room with whitewashed walls. Empty, aside from that one ticking clock. The door opens, and a doctor comes in. He's wearing a lab coat, the same color as the walls, and in his hands he is holding a notepad. He stands across from me, and for a while we just look at each other in silence. I break it. "You want me to tell you my story again?" The doctor nods. I sigh and revisit memories I'd rather want closed. It was like any other Saturday night. Often my friends and I would get blitzed in some sketchy pub and wake up in various different locations throughout town the next day. Dangerous, yeah. We were idiots, with little else to do. We believed we were invincible, untouchable, and that spending what time we did have, drinking to oblivion. Except this Saturday,
We had managed to strike lucky, and Andrew had found 2 girls who were willing to help us in our dumbass escapades. Normally, there were 3 of us: Andrew, Jaden, and me, Wayne. Andrew had met the girls at another party the day before, and claimed that they were willing to sleep with just about anyone. I felt a little uneasy, but they seemed like good people, humorous with just a little sass. By 6, we were already on our way downtown, a little tipsy from drinking prior, but ready for a whole lot more. The venue was exactly our kind, loud, packed, and even a little violent. I was a little interested in Rachel, one of the girls, and I think she was a little into me as well, catching her occasional glance. Andrew and Jaden were nowhere to be seen, and neither was Amy, the other girl. I only assumed what was already on my mind. So, with just the 2 of us, we partied for another few hours. It was 11 by the time Rachel and I had left. The police had turned up and had to break up the more rowdy guys. At this point, I was a little concerned as to where my friends were, but my mind was only focused on one thing. She led me to a more secluded area behind the portaloos. Not exactly the most romantic area, but I was already getting ready. Before my belt came undone, Rachel laughed and poured out a whiskey she had hidden in her bag. To the brim, she handed a glass to me, and I downed it without even thinking. Within moments, my head began to pound. Ignoring it, I tried to walk. My legs were buckling as I did so. My immediate thought was that I was so drunk I was about to pass out. But this was a little different. Suddenly, there was only darkness. What woke me wasn't the wind, or some hobo pissing on my face as usual, but the freezing water that had covered me up to the neck. In little islands, ice cubes floated around my bathtub I was in, and the realization of just how cold it was sent a shockwave through my system. I looked around, trying to rise up. It was an absolutely disgusting bathroom, every tile smeared with grease, the toilet overflowing. The stench was unbearable. Getting out of the bathtub was the easy part. The hard part was actually standing up. Shivering, I looked down and almost fainted. Scars dotted every part of my body, poorly made stitches holding together festering wounds. The water had served to drown out the pain, and now that I was out, it came back again, agonizingly. Every cut seemed to reverberate. I clenched my teeth and opened the door. The corridor I found myself in seemed much longer than it was. With each step, I made my way towards the stairwell 1,000 feet away. Blood splattered on the walls, drag marks on the floorboards. I felt an urge to vomit, swallowing it hard instead, the bile burning my throat. I made my way downstairs, creaking and almost stumbling several times. The nakedness of my body seemed so unimportant, I just wanted to get out. When I finally made my way to the bottom, I froze. I heard a familiar voice. It was Rachel, laughing hoarsely. Stupidly, I went towards the sound. If she was in trouble, I had the naive thought that I could save her. Last night's events were still fuzzy, and there were some thoughts I couldn't recognize. Turning a corner, I automatically ran the opposite direction. It was only for a split second, but that was all I needed. It was a dining room, and sprawled out onto the table was Andrew. Or what was Andrew? The only thing I could recognize was his face. The rest of his body seemed almost carved out. Surrounding him were various people in surgical clothing, and at the forefront of it all, Rachel, scalpel in one hand, another burrowing into Andrew's chest. The worst part? His eyes bore into me, and they looked more alive than ever, bloodshot and filled with fear. I eventually found my way to the front door, and to my relief, it opened. I heard a yell from behind, but I ignored it and hobbled on and on, with no aim. I was struggling to see even a few feet ahead of me. The pain began to take hold, until once again, there was only total darkness. I awoke again, but this time in this hospital. I never did find out what happened to Jaden, and I don't want to know. In fact, I want to forget this whole thing, but I don't think I ever will. Report. Patient has not remembered any of the faces of the dissection group, aside from one. She is to be terminated immediately. Successful surgery on said patient has yielded 1 kidney, 1 lung, most of the liver, various assortments. Full dissection is to be conducted in the next week. Overall estimated profit, $500,000. Got some Dunkin' Donuts this morning, and it brought this story back to mind. Figured I'd share it here. During high school and college, I worked at Dunkin' Donuts for about 7 years, and bounced around to a few different locations. I was used to working at the Dunkin' Donuts in my town, where we would get the yeast rings delivered periodically and frost them ourselves as needed. I transferred to a new shop, about a half hour from my house, with all the same responsibilities, except for the donuts. They were delivered by corporate, and they arrived frosted almost perfectly. They looked like the plastic donuts they show in commercials, always round and not squished together, and they would dip them in frosting so it was evenly spread and neat. It was a busy Saturday and was close to Valentine's Day, so we had a fresh order of brownie batter donuts delivered that morning. We were slammed, which was normal for a weekend, so it wasn't out of the ordinary to see my manager, who I'll call Jeremy, running around stressed out. When he first ran past me, I didn't think anything of it, and I continued making sandwiches at the sandwich station. He rushed by carrying a pastry tray, and I watched him begin frantically throwing something in the trash, looking worried as hell. At first, I laughed and just said, "Jeremy, what the heck are you doing?" He straightened out and looked absolutely beside himself. I had never seen Jeremy look so lost, so I asked what was going on and if something was wrong.
Someone's filled the donuts with staples!
He told me he got a phone call from corporate that one of the stores in our chain, which contained 10, had somehow discovered multiple staples in every donut in their order. That was at least 48 donuts from our store and more or less for the other 9. They told Jeremy we had to get rid of the most recent delivery because whoever put the batter in the filler dumped a ton of staples in it as well. Thankfully, we hadn't sold all of the previous order yet from the morning because it was still relatively early. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was going to be sick. What if a young child had gotten one of them? I pictured some family sitting at home on a Saturday morning, or going out to get some drinks and donuts for the kids, and imagined everything else that could have happened. I never found out what came of it, and as far as I know, neither did my boss. I'm assuming nothing happened, because I thankfully never heard anything on the news. Makes me wonder if they covered it up. And I hope they were able to find out who the asshole was who did it. So, Dunkin' Donuts terrorist, let's not meet. And I hope somehow you're rotting away somewhere. My name is Joseph, and I was traumatized at 14 years old. I was out in the park playing ball with my friends, who we will call Ivan, Vlad, and Nikita. Vlad had to go and study, so he left, and a few hours later, Nikita went home too. Instead, Ivan and I decided to stay for a little while longer, and continued playing ball for a few hours, until it was 11 o'clock. In the pitch black, we walked home, worried more of our parents' anger than the dangers of the night. We were leaving the empty park when a boy who was about 16 stopped us. He wore all black clothing, which weirdly contrasted his neon football boots. He introduced himself as Draven and asked if I wanted to play. Immediately, I felt uncomfortable and was about to respectfully decline and just walk past when Ivan stopped me and said that there was no harm in staying for another hour, because our parents would be mad either way, after all. I reluctantly agreed to play with him until midnight. We started playing ball, and surprisingly Draven had an awesome left foot. We also struck up a conversation, and we learned that Draven went to a school nearby. He loved playing football and video games, as well as sneaking out at night to practice football. He had aspirations to make it to the big leagues, and said that it was impossible without putting in the hard work. He seemed interesting and very polite, and friendly as well. I started to like Draven, and Ivan seemed to adore him. Eventually, when Ivan and I were about to go, as it struck midnight, Draven offered us some chewing gum. Ivan grabbed it out of his hand and gnawed away. I was a bit cautious at first, but gave in. The gum felt weird. It had me want to have it more. I looked over to Ivan, whose eye was a little twitchy. Instinctively, I asked if he had any more. Draven then said that he had hundreds of those gums at his house, and that he was also throwing a little party. If we came, he could give us some more. We agreed and left. He led us through the park into the dark forest, and we walked through for what seemed like over an hour before we reached a rundown, shabby, broken abandoned shack with a black van that was parked right in front of the house. But sure enough, we could hear loud music, the windows flashing with colors, and even what seemed like a woman's yelling. We walked inside the house. Before me was a group of men, much older and much bigger than Ivan and I, each holding an implement of pain, whether it was a bat, crowbar, or rope. They loomed over us, and one grabbed Ivan's wrist. That's when I bolted out of the front door. I had zero hesitation. It was only my quick reflexes which had saved me that night. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, and it was only then that I realized that I left Ivan behind. I pounded at my door and fell into my dad's arms, sobbing. The rest of my family had come downstairs, curious as to what the ruckus was all about. I told them in hushed whispers of what had happened, and immediately phoned Ivan's parents and then the police. They investigated the building and found nothing, claiming that the owner of the house had died some time ago. I recounted what I had seen to them, and with this information, they launched a search across the entire woods. Sure enough, they eventually found a recently dug hole where they uncovered the bodies of over 100 youths, the youngest being 4. Ivan had been beaten badly and his body used to store drugs. They even found my other friend Vlad. He had been killed just an hour before Ivan. But what scared me the most was the note that had been left on my pillow the next night. In bloody writing, the words, "You were lucky."